Good morning, everybody. Glad that everybody's here again to Theology. I am joined here with some Theology moderators, Nindio, Adriano Siosia in DC and New York, Jessica and Agustina from Jakarta, Indonesia. And we have a special guest today, Professor Tremper Longman III. His bio is very, very long, so I'll try to summarize it as best as I can. So Dr. Tremper Longman III is a distinguished scholar of biblical studies at Westmont College. He has written over 30 books, including single-volume commentaries on Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Daniel, Nahum. So it's a very long list, a very prolific biography. His most recent book with the psychologist Dan Allender is God Loves Sex, an honest conversation about sexual desire and holiness. His books have been translated into 17 different languages. In addition, as a Hebrew scholar, he's one of the main translators of the NLT, New Living Translation Bible, consulted on other popular translations of the Bible, including the Message and New Century Version and the Holman Bible. He's edited multiple study Bibles, Bible Dictionary, Baker Illustrated Bible Dictionary, How to Read Job with John Walton, Genesis with Zondra Van. So a very, very long history. And I got to meet Tremper in the context of religion and science discussion. So maybe today we will touch on that a little bit as well. And I think today I would start the conversation with a question, Tremper. I guess the question is, how have people traditionally read Genesis 1-3, and what is your reading of Genesis 1-3? Welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Arvin. Great to be with you all, and thank you for the privilege of talking about this important subject. And not to nitpick, by the way, Arvin, but God Loves Sex was 4 books ago. Just my most recent book is actually How to Read Daniel, which came out about a month ago. But let me address this question of Genesis 1-3. And first of all, let me say that Genesis 1-3 is in a broader context of Genesis 1-11, then a broader context of Genesis, then a broader context of what I call theological history of the Old Testament. So traditionally, when you ask what's the traditional reading of Genesis 1-3, it's actually hard to answer that question, because if you go back through the history of interpretation, there hasn't been sort of one interpretation that Bible-believing Christians and faithful theologians and biblical scholars have all agreed on. I mean, some people today think that a traditional reading is kind of the idea that Genesis 1-3 is not only giving us some kind of historical report, which you'll see I agree with, but that it gives a kind of literal, plain sense depiction of how God created creation, and also then kind of plain reading or literal depiction of the first sin. So that has been a reading through the ages, but also many people through the ages, going back to people like Augustine and Origen, have recognized that there's a considerable amount of figurative language within Genesis 1-3. So as I say, some people think that Genesis 1-3 should be read in a way that would lead us to think, for instance, well, it brought more broadly Genesis 1-11, that the cosmos was created just a few thousand years ago, that the first Homo sapiens, Adam and Eve, were created by the special act of God with no antecedents to it. Here's where this is what I think is the correct reading of Genesis 1 through 3. And when I say correct reading, what I mean is the reading that the original author of Genesis, Moses, if you will, wanted his readers to get out of Genesis 1 through 3. And when you ask that question, because that's what we do in interpretation, I believe. We're trying to hear the voice of the author. We're trying to hear the message that he's trying to communicate to his intended readership. We can't get into the mind of the original author except through the text, but we can study the text and make good decisions about what the author intended to communicate to us, the reader. And that's what literary communication's all about. But to do that, first of all, we have to remember a few things when we encounter a text like Genesis 1 through 3. First of all, we have to remember that actually we're not the intended audience. When the author sat down to write Genesis 1 through 3, the author, Moses, was not writing to us in the 21st century. He was writing to a contemporary audience. And the practical consequence of that realization is that we need to, as my friend John Walton puts it, remember that while the Bible was written for us, it wasn't written to us. And so we have to put ourselves in the ancient world and ask ourselves, from what we know about the ancient world, how are we to understand the words of the author? And that also gets us into the question of genre or literary type. As for decades now, I've been telling my students, genre triggers reading strategy. An author writes in a way that sends signals to the reader as to how to take their words. So those are a couple key fundamental things we need to keep in mind while we're reading Genesis 1 through 3. And without going through all the steps, which would take us a while, I do, by the way, talk about these steps in another recent book called Confronting Old Testament Controversies, Pressing Questions About Evolution, Sexuality, Violence, and History, that was published by Baker in 2019. And as I deal with those four controversial issues, I talk about hermeneutics or principles of interpretation. And I can't take you in this brief time we have together through all the steps, so maybe people might want to ask questions. I think as you look at Genesis 1 to 11, and remember I was setting it in its broader context, that it is the same genre as the rest of Genesis, as Exodus, all the way through Esther in the Old Testament. That is, it is what I call theological history. That is, it is talking about the past, things that actually happened in the past. The reason why I call it theological history is because the focus is on theology, not economics, not military history, etc. It's theological history because what it's interested in is talking about God and about our relationship with God. So in that sense, there is no difference between Genesis 1 to 11, Genesis 12 and following. But there is a difference in the way that the past is depicted in Genesis 1 to 11. And let's remember Genesis 1 to 11 is talking about the deep past. And it's covering a lot of time in a very brief period. Genesis 1 to 11 goes from creation all the way up to Abraham. And so, so the thing that strikes me as I read Genesis 1 to 11 is the, rather pervasive figurative language which is used in those chapters. I mean, think about it. As Origen and Augustine both noted, you can't have literal 24-hour days in Genesis 1, particularly since the sun, moon, and stars aren't created until the fourth day. So yeah, God could have some other source of light, to be sure, but Genesis days 1, 2, and 3 are described as days with evenings and mornings, which require a sun, moon, and stars. So the reader would know that obviously this is not trying to describe, not trying to describe creation as actually happening in 6 24-hour days. Or, the talk of the rakia, or the firmament vault, it's translated different ways, which has long been understood and still is by most scholars as a solid dome over the earth that separates the waters below from the waters above. That too is not to be taken as a kind of literal description of the way the cosmos actually is. That Genesis 1 and 2 isn't trying to teach cosmology, but rather is using an ancient Near Eastern cosmology to communicate truths about God and our relationship with him. Or take the fact that the first human in Genesis 2:7 is described as God taking the dust and breathing on it, and the ancient reader knew, and the modern reader should know, that God doesn't have lungs. He's a spiritual being. So this must be a figurative depiction and the figurative depiction is chosen to communicate some very important theological ideas, which is that, we're part of creation. We're from the dust, but we have a special relationship with God, and it's a dignified relationship. This really comes out when you put it in its ancient context, and you realize, say, that in Mesopotamian creation stories, Unuma Elish Atrahasis, humans are created from the clay of the earth, but then from the blood of a demon god. So there's this earthly element, there's this divine element, but there's a difference too, because the divine element is from a demon god. The Bible's very clear that humans are created in a dignified, they're dignified creatures, not contemptible creatures. And in Atrahasis, they all spit in it. So to kind of summarize, Arvin, I would say that as we read Genesis 1 and 2, the historical assertion is God created everything, even human beings. But because this creation is being depicted using figurative language, I would say the Bible's not interested in telling us how God created us. So if I could take it one step further, I would say that since the Bible doesn't address the how, that, we can safely turn to science and ask what insights we might gain from science, particularly since, historic Orthodox Christian thought has always believed that God didn't just give us one book, he gave us two books. The Belgic Confession, and I think in its Article 2, talks about these two books, and that is the book of Scripture and the book of nature. Not that one trumps the other, but I think we can safely say that when both are interpreted correctly, and let's remember that while the Bible is without error in all that it intends to teach, which is the definition of inerrancy, which I affirm, our interpretations aren't inerrant. Now, the scriptures are clear in that, and that's highlighted by theologians in what's called the doctrine of perspicuity, but it's clear, according to, say, the Westminster Confession of Faith, not in everything. Matter of fact, the statement on perspicuity begins, not all things are alike, clear in and of themselves, but those things that are essential to salvation are clear to us. And I'll submit to you that the question of how we're created isn't a part of, the mechanics or process of creation isn't a part of that essential for salvation. But what is the fact that God created us. And he created us at the beginning of the story of human beings who are given the status of image bearers. Humans are morally innocent. That's another thing that I think scriptures clearly teach, and which is important for our salvation. That, when turning now to Genesis 3, Genesis 3 may be a figurative depiction of a fall, but it is a depiction of a fall. That is an original sin that explains why we are sinners. We're not created sinful. Our sinfulness is a result of human rebellion against God. So that's kind of an overview of my thinking about Genesis 1 through 3. And of course, I know there are a lot of questions that flow from that, but maybe one more point, because I started by saying Genesis 1 through 11 is talking about the deep past. It's really a prequel. It's setting up the real story. In the Torah, the real story is the Exodus. So Genesis is kind of a prequel to Exodus. But within the book of Genesis 1 to 11 is a prequel, just getting background for the really significant moment in the book of Genesis, which is the call of Abraham, which notice how the narrative slows down and starts following the life of Abraham very closely, with nothing like the figurative depictions of the past that you get in Genesis 1 to 11. So there's no difference in kind between Genesis 1 to 11 and Genesis 12 and following, but there is a difference in how the past is depicted. And I would also point to, I'm writing a commentary right now. I'm finishing up a commentary on the book of Revelation, my first foray into the New Testament, but it's in a series called The New Testament Through Old Testament Eyes. So I'm writing on the book of Revelation. We have the same discussion there, right? In my view of Revelation is that, it's talking about, it's addressing contemporary issues at the time of the writing, sort of, critiquing Revelation, and it's also encouraging Christians to stay faithful in the midst of persecution. It's also looking to the far distant future in order to give them hope, because right now their situation is dire, looks like evil's in control. But by pointing to the end of history, it is saying, God is really in control, and don't worry, he's going to have the final victory. But as the future is described in Revelation, you again get figurative language, a lot of figurative language, talking about things that are going to actually happen. Jesus is going to come back again, but, it's pictured in a couple ways, like Jesus is going to come back riding a cloud. And then in Revelation 19:11 following, Jesus is going to come riding a horse with a sword coming out of his mouth. Now, I seriously doubt that is a kind of literal depiction of how Christ is going to return. Rather, it's a figurative depiction of things that are actually going to happen. So I hope that's what you were looking for, Arvin, but those are some of my thoughts about Genesis 1 through 3.
Thank you very much, Tremper. That was a good summary, I think, but also has a lot of content in terms of how people have approached the text and how you set up your hermeneutics from the historical reading, what historical means, that it can include figurative language, right? The genre is a theological history. And it is not the way we understand history, but it is the way how they portray history, which is a theological history, not a political or an economic history, the way we understand it today. I think you and John Walton also criticize us for using our category of history and transposing it into A&E literature, which is great. I guess my question is, coming from, the history of theology and science, we're kind of born from the apologetics tradition, and we always draw it to the Enlightenment, and people started questioning stuff. And if you are belligerent, then you're apologetics. And then if you're kind of in dialogue with the liberal Protestant tradition, then you're kind of in a religion and science dialogue. But I feel like this historical idea, the historicity of the Old Testament, has a long history in Old Testament theology itself. You've had your phrase in that. And my question is, when did we enter your fray in Old Testament theology, right? So let me try to, because I'm an outsider, let me try to recap what I see as Old Testament theology projection, and let me know if I'm correct in explaining, in trying to pin when religion and science enters. Okay, so if we have, right, for Wellhausen, from source criticism, right, reacting back to the 18th century that are more Mosaic, more federal theology, going back to source criticism, it's continued further into to the late 19th to 20th century with Goncourt. But from there, it kind of went downhill in the sense that, well, Old Testament theology is all just A&E, the Pan-Babylonian school, with Kyle Delitzsch, for example, saying this is propaganda, with Harnack. And I think from that period, early 1920s, I see two reactions. I don't know, I'm kind of Barthian. So the Barth reaction is the dogmatic theology, the Heilgeschichte, has to be above the Religionsgeschichte, right? Yeah. But there's also the revival of the religious history with Eichhorn against Essenkopf and von Rad later on, trying to say that no, there is an interaction here, and even the Jewish scholars like Jeskiel Kaufman or Nahum Sarna tries to say no, monotheism is already there against all this A&E background. So you have these two strands coming out, and I think the religion and science discussion comes in from the Barth tradition moving forward with Brevard, Childs, and also maybe Albright, that suddenly makes this dogmatic stuff really literalist. On the other hand, from von Rad, you kind of go up to theological. It is as if there's a flip. Do you think this is a fair assessment, that apologetics kind of react to this biblical theology tradition, while you, I think, are more in the A&E line from von Rad and everybody else, and it's like this is never an issue for us? Is this a fair overview?
Yeah, I think it is, Arvin. I think it's a fair overview, and maybe another way of articulating what you're getting at might be that on the one hand, you have those, when it comes to Genesis 1 through 3 specifically, who want to use a term like myth. It's myth. It's poetry. It's not, it's not history. And on the other hand, you have those who say, no, it is sort of, they react against that, which is what I think you're saying about the apologists. Somebody like Wayne Grudem, for instance, will say, no, this is the way, this is giving us a more literal depiction of creation. So it's kind of like what I would call a crude historical approach, Grudem, and a crude mythological approach. And I think that's a false choice, which I think that's what you're also saying, that somebody like Walton and I are saying it's not myth. Well, I mean, let's first of all, the problem with myth is there's a kind of there's a popular definition of myth and there's a scholarly definition of myth. So the popular definition of myth is simply it's fictional. It's not connected to history at all, and that's how I'm using myth. There is a more scholarly definition of myth, which is sort of like foundation stories, that these are a culture's stories that help us make sense of the world, and they could be somehow connected to history, actually. So myth isn't kind of inherently saying no history, and you can make a case that in that sense, yeah, Genesis as a whole is mythical. But I don't like to use that term because everybody thinks immediately no history. And as I've said, there is historical referentiality in Genesis, that God did create everything. He created human beings. And at the beginning of the story of Homo sapiens, who have been given the status, we may come back to this qualification, because I make a difference between the origin of Homo sapiens and the origin of what John Stott and others called Homo divinus, the Homo sapiens who have been given the status of being image bearers. But there is that happened in space and time, and then also Genesis 3 is historical in the sense that it's saying that there was a time when human beings rebelled against God. So I think, and if you read, and the reason why I'm kind of picking on Wayne, whom I've known for 40 years, probably for many reasons, but he just edited this lengthy book, which is a critique of what he calls theistic evolution, which most people today call evolutionary creationism. And in one of his chapters, he makes this dichotomy. It's kind of like what you do in political debate these days is you never address a moderate, whether somebody in the center as a moderate. What you do is you paint them as a radical, so Joe Biden is progressive leftist kind of thing. So or somebody else who's more on the right is on the far fringe. So it's easier to critique somebody that way, I think. So Wayne develops this, what I consider to be false dichotomy. And yeah, so long way of saying, yeah, Arvin, I think you got it right. And you mentioned Brevard Child. Of course, I got my doctorate at Yale when
right.
there. Though I didn't really study that much with Child. I studied with Kugel and Wilson and Hallow and Pope, and those were my main teachers. But of course, and by the time I got to Yale for my doctorate, I was already a student of Gerhardus Voss, who is a canonical thinker, and of course, what attracted many people to Child back in the day, particularly evangelicals, was Child's agreed that there was a diachronic dimension. I mean, he accepted the source criticism, the form criticism, etc. But he said, but we still need to treat the Bible in its final form. Now, the irony is that Childs, who had kind of, he, as I understand his story, became a Christian through InterVarsity at the University of Michigan, and then went off to Princeton to become the next B.B. Warfield. But then you don't go to Princeton to become the next B.B. Warfield, especially back then. Actually, Princeton's a more moderate place now than it was back then. And then Childs went off to Basel and got his doctorate, but he was so formally similar in his conclusions to evangelicals that he didn't want to have a lot of close association with evangelicals. So even though he was very attractive to evangelicals, from all accounts I got, since I didn't work that closely with him, he was difficult to work with as an evangelical. So,
thank you. Very interesting insights about Brevard Childs and all the legends from Yale.
They were legends. It was a great experience to go study at Yale back then.
Mm-hmm. I want to open it to the other moderators if you guys have any comments.
Well, sure. I will follow up. I'm not sure if this is related to Arvin's question, but Professor Longman, thank you very much for your presentation. We are connected in one or the other way because I have known you since my college study time, and my professor was a student of you during the old days. And so thank you that you are willing to be with us. My question is not related specifically to Genesis 1 or 3, but I want to, it's kind of setting a broader context. What do you think about biblical theology? For some scholars, they are quite skeptical to move toward theologizing the biblical complexity. So how would you take on that?
Sure, that's a great question. And first of all, let me give a shout out to your former professor, Cornelius Cuswanto, a very good friend for decades, and we communicate a lot together. And also back then, she's since died, Lynn Newell, who was an Australian, taught at your school, and she was also my THM student. And even though I think at the time I was 32 and she was probably 60, but a lovely woman, a very, very bright woman, wrote a really good thesis on Job. So, by the way, Justina. On Job. So let me address your question. And by the way, another project I'm doing is that Baker Books has asked me to write a 3-volume series called the Old Testament. Well, 3 volumes. The first one, Old Testament is literature. Second one, Old Testament is history. Third one, Old Testament is theology. It'll be a few years before I actually write the theology, but of course I've been thinking about the issue. First of all, I believe that even though there are multiple human authors of Scripture, of course, each with their own personality and contribution, and there are different emphases from different parts of the canon. I think ultimately God is the author of Scripture, and that there is a coherence, an organic unity to Scripture that can and should be explored in terms of its theological message. And so right now my thinking goes something like this, and this will inform how I write this Old Testament theology. And that is, you ask the question, what is the Bible about? And the answer is God. But the next question is, the next thing to realize, it's not about God in the abstract. It's not about God in the abstract, but it's about God in relationship to his creation. Theologians will talk about the aseity of God, that God doesn't need anything or anybody. And I think there's a place to make that argument. But I would say that the story of the Bible is telling us he may not need us, but he sure seems to desire a relationship with us. Okay, so the Bible's not about God in the abstract. It's about God in relationship with his people, and the Bible is God's self-disclosure to us ultimately. And in the Bible, it describes his acts in history, but also describes God himself. And one of the striking things to me is that the descriptions of God that we get in Scripture are largely, if not exclusively, figurative, metaphor and simile. God is a king who enters into a covenant with his people. God is a warrior who has, we're in his army, Ephesians 6:10 and following, and God war. So these are all related. God is a shepherd. We're his sheep. God is a father, and in some places in the Old Testament, a mother, and we are God's children. And of course, we go on and on. Even in a metaphor like God is a rock, okay, which is not inherently relational. It's not some rock out there. It's a rock in whom we find refuge. So as I imagine writing a theology and saying that, yes, we should and can, and that even though different books bring in different emphases, that ultimately they're all coherent, I see sort of focusing on these multiple metaphors of God and also seeing how they develop from the Old Testament into the New Testament, affirming the idea of progressive revelation. So I've written a lot on God as a warrior through the years, and you see there is a coherence to the account of God as a warrior from Genesis to Revelation, in that God is fighting evil, starting in Genesis 3. In the Old Testament, God fights evil by fighting the enemies of Israel, and when Israel goes astray, fighting Israel itself. And then at the end of the Old Testament, in voices like Daniel, Zechariah, Malachi, it's anticipating the coming of the warrior again, the divine warrior. And then in the New Testament, we read that Jesus comes and he's the divine warrior. He's heightened and intensified the battle, so it's against the spiritual powers and authority. There is a spiritual battle in the Old Testament, but humans aren't invited into it like they are in the New Testament. And this battle is won not by killing, but by dying. So Jesus, Colossians 2:13-15 talks about Christ triumphing over the powers by his death. And but that's not the end of the story either. I mean, in the apocalyptic portions of the New Testament, we read about Christ's second coming, where he completes the victory against all evil. And so there's a coherence there, but there's a development. So, and then, you can see, though, that if you just pick that one relationship metaphor idea and ignore the others, you're going to get kind of a warped perspective of who God is. And I think that's the error of people who focus only in on covenant theology. That's a really important biblical theological theme. Don't get me wrong. But and we Reformed people tend to focus in on that, I think partly because Reformed theology was developed by theologians who were lawyers like John Calvin. We like these legal, political metaphors, but we need to turn to our Pentecostal friends to get some of the more touchy-feely, figurative, God is our friend, God is, our husband, etc. So that would be my response to that question.
Thank you. That's a great response. You're trying to balance the covenantal view with more of an apocalyptic bent. The two has to be stable.
Yeah. And then bring in some other perspectives as well. I mean, you don't, even as we deal with all these, the reason why I think Arvind, God discloses himself through metaphor is partly because it's preserving the mystery of God, because metaphors teach true things, but indirectly. It's reminding us that we can have we can have a accurate understanding of God, but we never will have an exhaustive, complete understanding of God. That he's so, it's almost, it's kind of funny that in Deuteronomy and Psalms and elsewhere we'll read, "Who is like you, O God, on heaven or on earth? Nothing is like you. Mm-hmm. And you're like a king." So it's kind of reminding us, like, we could get these adequate glimpses of who God is, but don't think you have an exhaustive knowledge of who God is, and God will surprise you. Yes.
Arvind, I think this is a very interesting question from our audience. I think we can bring it up to Professor Longman. And I want to broaden this question. How would Professor Longman comment on Dr. Ann's notion of myth in Genesis? But I also want you to say something about Professor Walton's approach about the lost world of Genesis 1, Professor Longman, because, well, Professor Walton very well, but he also has very interesting proposals on how to read Genesis 1. So how would you comment on this?
Yeah, so let me comment on these two gentlemen who are among my best friends, both Pete Enns and John Walton. So Pete was my student at Westminster when I was a professor. I then encouraged him to go off to Harvard and get his doctorate. And then I was the chairman of the department when I hired him at Westminster. And then I left Westminster when Westminster was starting to change in a direction I was uncomfortable with. And I went off to Westmont College. And so Pete, I want to preface it by saying Pete is still one of my closest friends, but he knows that we disagree on some things like this. Okay, so, and indeed, Baker asked me to write that book, Confronting Old Testament Controversies, in order to give a kind of loving pushback on some of Pete's ideas. Now, that was particularly the case when it comes to divine violence, where Pete argues in his book, The Bible Tells Me So, that the picture of God as a warrior in the Old Testament is not how God actually is, but that God allowed Israel to depict him in ways that at that time and in their culture they thought was appropriate. So God's not really violent, but so I push back on that area. In the evolution question, Pete and I are both evolutionary creationists, but I do think Pete is wrong on a couple. I disagree with him on a couple of things. One is he takes a kind of approach, and is speaking in the evolution of Adam, say, of science says this, now get your mind around it. Whereas I'm saying, no, let's look at the Bible first, and let's recognize that the Bible's not addressing these questions, therefore we can go to science. And I think that may be just a kind of pedagogical difference ultimately, but I think it's an important one. The second thing is, I also think it shows too strong a dependence on science, because he'll go on in there and say, well, the fall never actually happened. And science doesn't allow us to think that there was any time in the history of Homo sapiens where there was a moment of innocence, but all the evidence is nature red tooth and claw, right? Interestingly, a lot of people are talking, as Arvin and probably all of you know, more about social cooperation now in the evolutionary process. And I really recommend this book by Augustin Fuentes called The Creative Spark. But here I would now cite Pope John Paul II, where he says, science can refine religion, but religion can keep science from idolatry and false absolutes. In other words, it's not all science can inform our understanding and interpretation of the Bible, but the Bible can tell us things that science couldn't possibly speak to. Like, of course, you're never going to find any kind of scientific evidence of a period of innocence, and so forth. So I do respectfully disagree with my friend Pete Enns, and on that topic. When it comes to John, I largely agree with John too, but I'm not sure I necessarily fully embrace the fundamental idea. And I think maybe this is what you're getting at, because he does a really good job of reminding us that Genesis 1 isn't focused on material creation, okay? But rather, he talks about Genesis 1 as an account of things coming into operation, kind of a functional approach. And I do agree with that largely, though I'm less bothered than he is about whether or not it might talk about some kind of material creation, as long as you understand that it's a figurative depiction of that material creation. I do agree that the ancient Near East was not interested in questions like, where did matter originate? Okay. And so we shouldn't be surprised if Genesis 1:1 and 2 isn't talking about the origin of matter. In other words, if the NRSV translation is right, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, the earth was formless and void, for which there's a really good argument to be made. I'm not disturbed by that. I mean, creation ex nihilo is taught in the New Testament. And I do think it's right to recognize that the question of the origin of matter was a question that people during the Greco-Roman period were interested in, not the ancient Near Eastern period. And again, it's part of remembering that the Bible isn't written to us, it's written to an ancient audience, which a more egregious error is made by people like Hugh Ross and his organization, Reasons to Believe, where they think they can detect in the Old Testament things that we only understand today through scientific discovery, like Psalm 104, 1 and 2, the heavens, God stretched out the heavens and the earth, and they say, look, that's the Big Bang Theory. And no, it's not. It's a tent metaphor. So I learn a lot from both Pete and John, but have my differences with both of them, more with Pete on this subject than with John. Oh, and by the way, John and I agree so much that we co-wrote a book on the flood called Lost World, the Flood. Arvin mentioned that. So story about that is about 8 years ago, John came up to me and said, Tremper, you write this series of book called How to Read Psalms, How to Read Proverbs and stuff. We just did Job commentaries. Let's do How to Read Job together. I said, well, the first thing, a place where John and I disagree and Pete and I agree is over Christological or Christotelic readings of the Old Testament. And John, is critical of that kind of approach, partly, I think, to sort of keep people like me from going too quickly to that New Testament perspective, really dwelling on the contribution of the Old Testament to theology itself. And so I said, so John and I had to negotiate that. I said, John, I have this interest in you. And he goes, you can write that chapter, which I did. And he actually liked the chapter. And then later I said, hey, John, you and I do a lot of talking about Genesis 1 through 3, but then often people will come up and say, what about the flood? What about the flood then? And I said, let's write a book about the flood. He said, sure. Now there it was interesting where we had a kind of interesting, friendly negotiation was I wrote a chapter in that book on, what I see as a theological pattern throughout Genesis 3 through 11, which is stories, and David Kleins wrote a really good book about this, that sin, judgment speech, token of grace, judgment. So they have this interesting, and I wrote that chapter and John wrote back and said, no, it's not moral theological, and he goes, this is a story of order and disorder. And I said, yes, it is, but disorder has a moral quality to it. So we went back and forth and we wrote 2 chapters. so he wrote the sin, the disorder order. I wrote the and it worked out nicely because I certainly affirmed the categories of order and disorder, but I think in distinction from John, who I think at this point is maybe not recognizing enough of a difference between the ancient Near East and the Bible, but he would argue. But don't get me wrong, I think everybody should read everything that John Walton writes. It's really good.
Thank you, Tremper. Yeah, I think it's very interesting between you, Pete and John, that there are always overlaps. And Yosia here has a question.
Maybe Tina first, after Tina.
Why me? Thank you, Ko Adrian. Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. I think like this, in the book of Genesis 3, it says that nature was also punished due to human sin. Nature is unable to produce its own food for humans, for themselves like this. It must be cultivated by humans themselves. Unfortunately, when humans continue to produce their food, nature is increasingly damaged and suffering. At first, the soil grew seed growing from its body, but now man is working on even forcing the earth to produce more and more. I think humans continue to sin in carrying out orders to manage this earth. I mean, even in doing God's work, humans continue to make mistakes, make sins like this. What do you think about this?
Yeah, that question raises all kinds of interesting points. First of all, going, there's no question but what Genesis 3 is telling us is that human sin has an effect on the rest of creation. And that Genesis 2 in particular presents this picture of harmony in God's creation, not only between God and humans, but between Adam and Eve and between Adam and Eve and their environment. Now, I think it's probably right to think of the depiction of Eden, which I think is figurative language, but as a particular location, and that in Genesis 1, when they're told to, subdue and rule, and I would argue as benevolent rulers created in the image of God, I think right there you actually have the beginning of a theology of creation care, even though unfortunately it's been taken by some through history as an excuse to exploit creation. It's actually a mandate for human beings to be stewards of creation and to take care of creation. So when the fall comes, as you rightly point out, there is an effect on creation, particularly in the punishment that is specifically addressed to Adam. But of course, even though it's specifically addressed to Adam, it has ramifications for everybody, not just Adam. And of course, Paul in Romans 8:18 and following talks about how the creation was subjected to frustration and groans. So that the subjection to frustration, first of all, that word frustration in Greek is mateotes, which is the word used to translate hevel or meaningless in Ecclesiastes. But ultimately, that's looking back to Genesis 3, was subjected as a so-called divine passive. God subjected it. But then Paul goes on to talk about hope, because of the redemption. So all that to say that Christians should be at the forefront of creation care issues. Christians should, it's not a matter of, well, God has punished the earth. And no, I mean, if you have a garden, what do? Yeah, weeds grow up, you pull them out. All right, and taking that on a broader level, as the earth is environmentally damaged, Christians should be out there pulling out weeds, and also anticipating the new heavens and the new earth. I mean, I don't think we're to sit around, and we're certainly not to continue the exploitation of creation, nor are we simply to sit back passively and wait for God to change everything. No, we should be out there, advocating for and working for the improvement of our environment. So again, and actually another recent book. Sorry to keep talking about them, but I wrote them so that people will read them. It's called The Bible and the Ballot, Using Scripture and Political Decision. I have a chapter in there. So basically that book says, why should we care what the Bible says about, well, first of all, it says the Bible does not give a specific public policy, but it gives us principles to think through as we develop public policy, or as we advocate for public policy, or we decide who to vote for. And then secondly, it also should shape our attitudes as we think about these issues. So that realization dawned on me as I heard the very vitriolic rhetoric coming even from Christians on, say, immigration. It's like, there's no place for that type of rhetoric or attitude toward people, or even approving or tacitly approving of a leader who might say horrific things about, people seeking to come into our country. So I talk about why the Bible is, Christians should look to the Bible because it can give us these principles. And then secondly, how do you read the Bible? So to get those principles, because it's not as simple as proof texting from the Old Testament. You got to ask issues of continuity and discontinuity. So I give a kind of introduction to how to navigate those issues of continuity and discontinuity. And of course, there are issues too about what's the relationship of the people of God to the broader culture and the state in particular. For one thing, I don't think we're to look to the state as a place where all our values are going to be coerced on the broader culture, even on issues like same-sex marriage and abortion, which of course I'm pro-life and I'm, and I think biblical marriage is a marriage between a man and a woman. But does that mean we should look to the state to impose these on others? I get into those kind of issues in my book. So I look at 10 different public policy issues, including environment there.
I totally vouch for that book. I mean, just chapters here, 7, 8, 9, 10 are on abortion, capital punishment, immigration, and same-sex marriage.
Yeah, that's
very, very hot, hotly debated topics in the U.S., but also abroad. Yeah.
Well, now that I'm old, I'm not hesitant to get involved in. I prefer to keep it civil and to interact with, because that's part of the point of my book is we shouldn't demonize people who disagree with us.
Right. Yosia, do you have a question?
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much, Professor Longman, for your lecture. And as Nindyo said, I remember a time in my college like that. Yeah, Professor Cornelius. Yeah, it's you remind me to him. Yeah. But so my question is, so as far as I know, the relation between science and also Genesis, I mean, Ian Barber famously said about 4 models like that. There's a conflict and independence, dialogue, integration, and and what I want to ask is for you, which models, which more prominent to discuss the relation between science and also Genesis?
Yeah.
I think it's still
contradicting today. Yeah, that's a great question. And what I think one of the things I want to avoid, which is only too prevalent today, is the idea that the faith is perpetually in conflict with science. It's like that's a mistaken idea that needs to. And I'd go back to what I said about the 2 books, Theology. Now, when I say science and the Bible will not conflict when both are interpreted properly, that doesn't mean that there won't be times when scientists will say something that we'll need to go, wait a minute. But when I say wait a minute, I don't mean what we need to avoid is a kind of knee-jerk reaction against science. And we certainly should avoid conspiracy theories that throw questions on the whole scientific enterprise. I think that's been very dangerous. I think some people in the young Earth creationists category know that science has massive evidence against the idea that the Earth is only 6,000 years old. Multiple lines of evidence, including how long light takes to get to Earth, et cetera, et cetera. And so in order to counter it, you have to attack science itself, and that's dangerous, because then, and I've noticed this in the present, some Christians' reaction to the virus in the United States. You say, well, the scientists are telling us we should wear masks, that will help. And I've gotten reactions when I posted something like that on Facebook. Tony Fauci's a liar. It's like, or Francis Collins, isn't a true Christian kind of thing. And you go, where's this coming from? But I think it comes from this culture war. Now, so in my book on climate change, that's another area where Christians have pushed back and said, I don't trust the scientists. And in my book, I say, look, when you have, it's not that every single scientist speaks the truth, but when you have a massive number of scientists who are in their field and knowing what they're talking about, saying something, we need to listen to them. Sometimes you'll see these lists of scientists against evolution, and you'll get a list of 500 scientists. Look at that list. They're medical doctors, they're engineers, there may be physics professors, they may be mathematicians. That's not to say they're not brilliant people, but it is to say they don't know what they're talking about. I talked to my colleagues in the physics department about this once, and I said to him, look, I've heard it said, and Francis Collins said this, that, other scientists and others really don't know the field like research biologists do. And he said, oh yeah, that's definitely true. I'm a physicist, but that biology stuff. So that's a different world for me, but it makes me think, yeah, I know ancient Sumerian, but if you ask me a question about Chinese, okay, I'm not going to be able to answer. I'm a linguist, but I don't know every language. I don't know. So yeah. Well, and another area though, Adrianus, is in the area of ethics. And so sometimes scientists will say things that are true or possible, but then ethical questions will arise. And then, theologians and others and Christians should raise questions. Yeah. Again, not in a knee-jerk reaction way, but.
Right.
So there should be a dialogue. I'm involved with something called Science for Seminaries, with a section of the AAAS called Dialogue on Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion. And I have been since 2013. And that's the kind of thing we need to cultivate, a friendly, respectful interaction.
Right.
Wow.
Exactly.
Thank you very much for the answer. Cool.
Jessica, your turn.
Yeah. By the way, Professor Longman, we have a lot of questions from the audience, and I will show a couple of them. And the first from Grant Nixon, he said that, Dr. Tremper, in your Old Testament introduction book, you briefly analyze about the Mosaic authorship, but in the ending, you conclude that Mosaic authorship might be accompanied by later other source. And this is the question. Do you think that the sources had affected the theological history message with their political interests or other interests? If do, how to interpret it proportionally?
Yeah, thank you.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you. Good question. Yeah, I in my introduction I defend essential Mosaic authorship, but also recognize that there are earlier sources, even the Toledot. This is the account of creation and earth, and so all the way through Genesis, which is an indicator of earlier oral, and even in the case of Genesis 5:1, this is the written account of, I think it's Adam. Yeah, Genesis 5:1. So but then also there are clear indications of later additions to the Torah. They're the so-called post-Mosaica, or the Chaldeans, or a reference to the city of Dan in Genesis 14. But there even evidence, like in the book of Deuteronomy, you have a narrative voice that you'll occasionally hear that talks about things happening across the river, by which then they're pointing to things that happen in Jordan. Now, Moses never got into the promised land where Jordan would have been across the river. So I don't think we should at all be nervous about this. In terms of, because God uses anonymous authors anyway. We don't know who wrote Joshua. We don't know who wrote Judges. We don't know who wrote Job. We don't know, and it's likely that, say, it's possible at least that Job was written over a period of time by more than one person. But what's important to us is the final form of the book. So I do think the Torah came to its final form probably in the post-exilic period. Certainly political interests, ideological interests shape all writing. The question isn't whether there's ideology in the presentation of history in the Bible. There is. The question is the ideology true or not? And so it's like, look at the book of Judges. A book of Judges likely had a major addition at the time of David or the monarchy. And there probably is a political interest in talking about the benefits of the monarchy over tribalism. But that was part of God's purposes, to move Israel to a kingship. So great question. Thank you.
Well, maybe Jessica, do you have a question?
Okay, thank you, Professor Longman. I am interested in your view about Genesis 1 to 3 as theological history. I have two questions for you. The first is, there is a view which also held by N.T. Wright about Adam and Eve, that they are representatives for all human beings, like maybe king and queen from all humanity, and they are therefore historical figures. Do you agree with this view? And the second one is, how do you see sexuality and gender in Genesis 1 to 3 based on your framework on theological history? Is there any difference interpretation about sexuality and gender from traditional view?
Great. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. First of all, anecdotally, I first became acquainted with Tom Wright's views on this when I sat on a panel with him in New York City at a Biologos event. It was Francis Collins, me, and Tom Wright. I felt kind of intimidated with that great biologist and great New Testament scholar, but both have since become friends. And yeah, so Tom writes about this briefly, at least, in Surprised by Scripture, and I think it's a viable idea. Okay, I think that that's one way of thinking about, because remember, the Bible's not teaching evolution. It's not. It's not. I don't want to move toward a kind of concordism. So it's like any kind of harmonization, even within the Bible. I mean, some of you know that we have issues of harmonization. Just to give one example, Joshua 1 through 12. If you just read that apart from everything else, you would come away with the idea that Joshua and the Israelites took the whole land of Canaan. End of story. You turn to Judges chapter 1, and it says after Joshua died, who's going to go up against, et cetera, et cetera. And also from Joshua 13 and following, we read there's actually Joshua took less than half the land. So how do you harmonize those two? And we can present harmonizations, I won't do it now, that would indicate that both can be true. We can do more than one harmonization. That's the thing. And that's okay, because you're showing, by doing that, you're saying, yeah, both can be true. The one I prefer is simply that Joshua 1 through 12 is celebrating the beginning of the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. So it's using, in keeping with ancient Near Eastern battle reports, like Lawson Younger argued in his published doctoral dissertation, that battle reports in the ancient Near East often came with hyperbole. But the hyperbole serves a theological purpose of celebration. And then Joshua 13 and following, Judges 1, then kind of gives a more detailed analysis of the results of Joshua's battle activities. So this is a question of harmonization. And there's more than one scenario where you can harmonize what the Bible teaches with evolutionary theory. And one of the ways that Tom advocates is that Adam and Eve are a specific couple within a broader group of Homo sapiens, but they're designated by God. They're kind of the king and queen, as you said, Jessica. Walton will sometimes talk, pointing to the priestly language or the temple language in Genesis 2, of this couple being more priestly than royal, but I think if you go that way, it could be both. Now, I think, yeah, that could be one way of thinking about the issue. The other way of thinking about the issue is that God designates a group of Homo sapiens to endow with his status. And so I developed my ideas along with explaining, Tom and John idea. By the way, John raises that as a possibility. I mean, yeah. So in any case, I talk about these different possibilities there. I think, though, what's really important to keep in mind is that there is a historical reality behind this figurative depiction. Oh, and I'm sorry, I forgot the second. Oh, gender and sexuality. Yeah. So I actually write about this in that book, Confronting Old Testament Controversies, in the section on sexuality, as well as my psychology friend and I wrote a whole book on marriage based on Genesis 1 through 3 called Intimate Allies, that came out about 15 years ago. So we learn an awful lot, I believe, about those topics in Genesis 1 through 3. And we can't talk about all of them, but I do, the one area that I would put emphasis on is I think we learn a lot about the equality between men and women in Genesis 2. Okay, and that's part of the figurative depiction of the creation of the first woman, as she's created from his side or rib. That's a indicator of mutuality and equality. Not from his head, not from his feet, but from his side, as the rabbis and Charles Spurgeon said. She is to be a helper corresponding to him. Now, that word helper, ezer, implies no subordination, because, read the book of Psalms, that word ezer is used a dozen times for God being the helper of Israel. I actually think it's better to translate that, or to understand it at least, as ally, that they are allies. That's where Dan and I got the title of our book, Intimate Allies, about marriage. Because even though there's no hostility in Eden yet, there's the threat of hostility as demonstrated or depicted as the walking serpent in Genesis 3. And that God had commissioned Adam to tend and guard, shamar, the garden. So it's often translated something like take care of shamar, but its more basic meaning is to guard it. So then Adam and Eve are to guard the garden. And yes, I do think that Genesis 2 pictures marriage as a couple leaving their parents, uniting together, and joining together in sexual union. Now, later people will say, well, what about polygamy? Because the law permits polygamy. Isn't this an indication that Genesis 2 isn't giving us God's ideal? And I would say no, because it's really clear that the case law, which is applying the principles of the Ten Commandments, are not taking Israel and pushing them toward God's ideal, but moving them in that direction. Remember what Jesus says about divorce. He said, when he said you could only divorce because of sexual infidelity, and the disciples go, what are you talking about? Moses said we could divorce for basically any reason. He goes, he doesn't say Moses was wrong. He doesn't say you misunderstand Moses. He says, Moses spoke because of the hardness of your heart. In other words, the case law was appropriate then, but now that I've come, we're ready to move further toward that ideal. So some people refer to this as the redemptive ethical trajectory on topics like polygamy, patriarchy, and slavery, but not everything's on that redemptive ethical trajectory. You have to show that the case law isn't legislating what God's creation ideal is. Also, when it comes to patriarchy, slavery, etc., you see that Israel is more progressive than the surrounding nations. And then you have to show movement into the New Testament. So William Webb wrote a really helpful book, Slavery, Women, and Homosexuals, where he shows that women in slavery are on this trajectory, but not, say, homosexuality.
Well, thank you, Professor Longman. Maybe this is the last question. There are several questions that I say to you, but maybe you already mentioned the answer. But in indirectly way, but I think it's already mentioned. But there's one question I think that we haven't talked about it. It's about soul. I will show it. It's like total Tremper. Does Genesis provide any information regarding the components of human beings, either tripartite, bipartite, or other possibilities? In modern days, seems we are losing spirit and soul, and this is and hence becoming more materialist. Do you think today we can still adopt the tripartite view? What do you think about it?
Yeah, that's a good question. That gets into another science issue, by the way, neuroscience. Yeah, I would say personally that the Bible is consistently looking at us as embodied persons. Okay, that I don't think we're to take this figurative depiction of God breathing into dust to say that he's like putting into the material intangible soul. I think the Bible is pretty consistent in thinking of us as embodied creatures. I mean, the Bible doesn't teach, for instance, the immortal soul. It teaches the resurrection of the body. So I don't think, though, that So I think we could still talk about a soul when we talk about, kind of our internal self. I don't think we should. So I wouldn't. That can devolve into kind of a materialism among, say, non-Christians for sure, and we have to be careful of that. But God prizes us as whole people. He loves our bodies as well as our of other aspects of who we are. I kind of tend to think of it like, we'll talk about things like the emotions and the intellect and the will as if they're three completely separate things, but they're really just all intertwined together, but they're different ways of emphasizing different aspects of who we are. There's no, you'll hear sometimes people don't trust your emotions, as if we should trust our intellect, by the way. So, or that our mind and our emotions are somehow separate from each other. That's the way I kind of think about soul and body as well. If you study the Hebrew term nephesh, which is the one that's translated soul, you'll see that sometimes that word nephesh is used for even dead bodies on a battlefield. So you have to be a little careful of reading too much into a body soul or a body spirit soul division, but God loves us as whole people.
Okay, I will give back the time to Arvin, please.
No, thank you, Professor Longman, for all the time. Nindyo, do you want to say a few things? Oh, you're on mute.
All right. So we planned to have these sessions for 1 hour and 15 minutes, but we are almost 1 hour and a half for this session. So thank you for your patience and thank you for your generosity, Professor Longman. We know that many responses that we could not answer and address, but your generosity and your expansive knowledge in this area is very enlightening for us. So thank you very much for stopping by on our channel and your sharing with us. We're really grateful for that. And we do hope that this is not the last time for you to be with us sometime in the future. We would love to have you back on our channel, Professor Longman.
Well, thank you. It's been great, a privilege. Enjoyed the questions, great questions, and love to come back on your.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Longman. It's very cool. Awesome.
Thank you,
Professor.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye.
Okay, thank you, friends. Bye.